Okay, welcome back. I missed 2 weeks of the shiur while I was away, and I know that you had 2 very interesting shiurim with Rabbi Rausman, who dealt with an important but side topic to our discussion. He talked about the last 8 psukim in the Torah. It happens that right now, as we speak, I'm in Efrat, but right now, as we speak in Yerushalayim, Rabbi Bravender is finishing his Parsha shiur. Every week on Thursday nights, he gives a Parsha shiur. If you're in Israel, you can attend. It's live at Ohel Nechama in Yerushalayim on Rehov Shopan, and you can subscribe to get the source sheets sent to you by in advance, and you can also get the MP3s of the shiurim shortly after, probably within a half hour or an hour or so of the time we're done. That MP3 will be available online at the URL I just put up in the chat, which is atid.org/shiur, SHIUR, and you can get the MP3 and the source sheet of the shiurim. You can also get it on iTunes, through iTunes. You can search for Bravender on iTunes. But tonight he's talking about a related topic, which is the chronology of Matan Torah. We touched upon it in our earlier shiurim, and I know that it is relevant to the topic that you were discussing with Rabbi Rausman while I was away, and that question of what exactly happened at Matan Torah. We had discussed last time, I'm sure you all reviewed your notes to just refresh your memory of what it is we were talking about before we started the shiur tonight. But you remember we were talking about the machloket in Sechet Megillah, about whether the Torah was chatuma or Megillah, how the Torah was given. When we talk about Matan Torah, so it seems the most conventional view is that certain things were given to Moshe at Har Sinai, but not the kind of notion that you may have, still in your brain from wherever it is that you learn these things as children, or sometimes, as adults, that at Har Sinai, Hashem gave Moshe the entire Torah from the Bet in Bereshit until the Lamed in Le'enei Kol Yisrael, what we today call the Chumash. That's not necessarily the case, that it unfolded as it went along. And that's the topic of his Parsha shiur tonight. So it's really an important supplementary topic and fills out, I'm sure, some of the things that we had been talking about. So I encourage you in about a half hour, an hour after the shiur is over, to go there and to listen to that shiur, either tonight or tomorrow or whenever. And certainly subscribe. If you go to that site I sent you, you can subscribe to get the source sheet sent to you in advance every week. Usually, even if you don't attend the shiur, it's worthwhile going through the sources that he puts together. Usually, it's a really very interesting array of psukim. Rashi and Rambam are almost always present. Sometimes it's the Netziv, sometimes it's one of the Hasidic masters. He has a particular affinity for Rabbi Nachman or the Sfas Emes, etc., etc., etc. So it's always worth it, even just to learn through the sources on your own. The Meshiloach, correct. Let's go back to the Rambam. We're going to skip ahead a little bit from what we. The link is there in the chat box. If you look in the chat box, it's right there. It's www.atid.org/shiur, SHIUR. We're going to skip ahead a little bit in the Rambam. We were looking at the Rambam's Hakdama Leperush HaMishnayot, his introductory to the commentary on the Mishnah. It's his commentary on the Mishnah, which is the history and mechanics of Torah She-Baal Peh. We essentially finished the first section. The second section, which I'm skipping, deals with a very, very important topic, but since it's a little less central to the overall theme that we're trying to look at, I'm going to skip it, but I encourage you to look at it. It's the topic of Nivu'ah, how prophecy works. Now the Rambam is skipping ahead to a question that we left off last time. We addressed it partially. I think that's Saul Orbach, who seems to be absent tonight, but I'm sure he's listening to the archives. So I'll address him. Saul Ormach's question about Yehoshua. Where's Yehoshua in the whole picture? He seemed to have been left out of the first chapter. Now the Rambam says, jumping ahead a generation, after Yehoshua dies. When Yehoshua died, Masar ma she-Baal min ha-perush umin uma shehutza bizmano velo nafla bo machloket. Yehoshua passed over to the next generation ma she-Baal min ha-perush, the accepted, authoritative, inherited explanation of the written Torah, and ma shehutza bizmano, and the derived Torah, the things that were studied out and derived from the exegesis of the written Torah, which had no machloket. And ma shenafla bo machloket v'nifsak bo kedat harov. There were three categories of Torah She-Baal Peh, of oral law. The accepted interpretation, the received tradition, that's what it means, ma she-Baal, number one. Number two, ma shehutza, that which was derived and about which there was no machloket. And then the third category, things about which there was machloket, about which there was difference of opinion, but which was resolved, shenifsak, that was we reached a conclusion, a definitive normative conclusion, a psak halakhah, according to the dat harov, according to the majority opinion. According to the majority opinion, that is the principle by which we determine halakhah. Acharei harabim lahatot. This week is Parshat Mishpatim. When we learned Masechet Sanhedrin together, a number of you were with us from Masechet Sanhedrin, either in my shiur or another shiur when we learned Sanhedrin last year. I suggested that although learning the entire Chumash with Rashi is an imperative, and the commentary of Rashi is essential on Chumash, I had suggested that there are certain parshiot are, to paraphrase Orwell, all parshiot are equal, but some parshiot are more equal than others. Parshat Mishpatim, this week's parsha, is more equal than others in the sense that if you really want to study the Torah, if you really want to master the Torah She-Baal Peh, one must study Rashi on Parshat Mishpatim, on this week's parsha. And although knowing that alone doesn't solve all of your Torah learning needs, it's not possible to save yourself from being an Am Haaretz without knowing all of the Rashis on Parshat Mishpatim very well. Acharei harabim lahatot, we're talking about the Parshat Shavua. So the corpus of the Torah She-Baal Peh, which the Rambam here kind of dissect. Hello, are you there? Testing. Is there a sound problem? Now I'm back. Sorry about that. V'heim asher amar hakatuv bahem v'chol yimei azkenim asher arichu yamim achrei Yoshua, etc., etc., etc. So Yoshua gives the Torah She-Baal Peh to the Zkenim, to the council of elders, as it were. And then the Rambam explains that at a certain point there was the founding of this organization, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, which is a type of expanded Sanhedrin of sorts, 120 members. This 120 member Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the Lahavdil Elef Alfei Avdalot, the modern Israeli Knesset, the name chosen from this same term, also has similarly 120 members as a type of zecher to this great assembly the Anshe Knesset HaGedola, which constituted the authoritative Torah teaching body for many generations. And the Rambam lists who these were, and again he emphasizes this point that we said last time, that to emphasize the integrity of the system. And he lists generation after generation, as it were, of who was whom and who were the members of this assembly, and these were the figures that were the, I mean, dare I say, the proto-Tanaim, the generations before the Chachamim, the sages that we call the Tanaim, the authors of the Mishnah. Let me just write this up on the board here. In Aramaic, we call the sages of the Mishnah, we call them either Atana or in plural the Tnaim. Oh, I seem to have overwritten there. One second, let me just get that up on the board. I hope you can see that. Atana or the Tnaim. These are the sages of the Mishnah who live roughly from the year 0, Common Era, till about the year 200. That's the period of the Tanaim. That's the period of the Tanaim. Ka'asher higia hazman achareihem el Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy master, our holy rabbi, is none other than Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who is the codifier of the Mishnah. He's the codifier of the Mishnah. Interestingly, the Rambam doesn't make this point, that originally the Torah She'Ba'al Peh was exactly that. It was Ba'al Peh. It was an oral tradition. All of the teachings of from Moshe Rabbeinu up until Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the oral Torah was precisely that. It was oral. It was an oral tradition, and it was memorized, or at least large sections of it were memorized by the Chachamim and by everybody, by even common Jews would commit portions of it to memory. At a certain point, around the year 200, plus or minus, which is again about 130 years after the destruction of Bayit Sheni, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, because of the imperative nature of the times, even though in principle this is an oral law, he violates the tradition and commits it to writing so that it should be preserved. And everything that we've been talking up until now, this body of received interpretation, of expanded interpretation, of halakhot, of gzerot dirabanan, etc., 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 was committed in the Mishnah by Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Alav HaShalom. V'haya yachid b'doro, v'echad b'zmano. He was unique. He was singular in his generation and in his time. V'haya ish shekibet Hashem bo midot meshubachot u'sgulot shahaya ru'ui b'glalan etzel anshe doro shekruhu Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Right? He was called Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy master, because he possessed, Hashem, God, bestowed upon him outstanding characteristics, and he was a man of outstanding traits and charm, and he was really one of a kind. V'haya shmo Yehuda. The Rambam's praise for Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who's also usually called in the Gemara, in the Talmud, he's usually just called Rabbi, the rabbi, par excellence, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. The Rambam has a deep love and respect for Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He writes about it here. It's a theme that he returns to in other places, in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, most famously in a couple of letters that he writes, which maybe we'll look at in a minute. And there are a number of reasons. There were a number of reasons for this. He points out that it was said, "Mimei Moshe va'ad Rabbi lo ra'inu Torah u'gdula b'makom echad." From the time of Moshe until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, we did not see Torah and greatness and majesty combined in one place. And the Rambam is saying that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is just a hair's breadth away from the level of Moshe. He was the greatest figure from, in Jewish history from the period after Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, of course, this foreshadows what would be said about the Rambam himself. Mimoshe v'ad Moshe lo kam k'Moshe. From Moshe Rabbeinu until Moshe ben Maimon, there were none as great as Moshe. But here the Rambam is saying it in regard to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the author or the codifier of Mishnah. Now I'm going to refer, very often you'll hear Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi referred to as the author of the Mishnah. This is not technically correct. It's more precise that he was the codifier of the Mishnah. Let me put it this way. Hold on a second. Let me get a whiteboard up here. Let's say that this is the set of all Tannaitic literature. This is the set of all of the teachings of the Tanoim. Now, this doesn't include every single thing that ever came out of the mouth of a Tana, right? In other words, if Mrs. Tana came home from the supermarket, and her husband said, "Honey, did you remember to pick up the milk?" That's not a Tannaitic teaching. But all of the authoritative teachings of the Tanaim, let's imagine this is a set of all the teachings. What Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did was two things, likely. He codified a very large section into the Mishnah. By codifying, I mean he took the statements of the Chachamim that came a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations more before him. We're talking about a very long period. We're talking about a very long period of time. And he codified them. But he wasn't the author of every one of those statements. Sometimes he was merely quoting Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Akiva, etc., etc., etc. And he ordered them. He organized them into 6 categories, what we call the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. Shisha Sidrei, the 6 orders, sometimes abbreviated Shin Samech as Shas. Right? When we talk about Shas, generally, colloquially, we're referring to a set of the Talmud, those books on the shelves. It also happens to be the name of a political party here in Israel, but that's not what we're talking about. But Rabbi Yehuda organized the Mishnah into 6 overarching categories: Zroyim, Moed, Nashim, Nezikim, Kodshim, and Taharot, each of which deals with a large overall topic. And each seder, each order, is subdivided into masechtot, into tractates. No, somebody asks in the chat, it's not Shelot and Shuvot. No, that's something else. Shelot and Shuvot, or Shutim, or I'll write it up in Hebrew. We're talking about Shas, which is an acronym for the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. Shut is something else altogether. Shut is an acronym for She'elot Uchuvot, which is the genre of rabbinic writing that began to flourish in the mid-medieval period, and until today. And those are responsa. They're also called responsa in English. Those are questions and answers. People would ask a question. They would send a question in the mail or however they did it in the days before email, before you could buzz. Now, all you have to do is buzz your shailot on Gmail. But they'd send a letter, and the rabbi would send back a response. Sometimes it was a very, very detailed response. And Rabbonim very often would collect up letters and publish them, and that's what we have collections of these shutim, of these shailot utshuvot. There are, of course, many from the medieval period that are of great significance, and there are, of course, many from the modern and even the contemporary period. Nowadays, they have shutim on SMS. You can SMS your question in, and you get a response back, sometimes immediately, depending upon who it is that you're asking a question from. So don't confuse these two things. Shas, Shisha, Sidrei, Mishnah are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. By the way, this is a really good example of the benefits of using WebEx. This question that somebody just asked, only he and I know, or she and I know, who he or she is. And nobody else knows that that person asked the question. So I was able to respond, and nobody, in this case, the person asked the question based upon either an error or misunderstanding, and nobody else even knows who that is. So there's no reason. Feel free to ask these types of questions. You can write to me privately or directly, and nobody else sees your question, and I can either respond or not respond to it. So that's the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did. The categorization and the organization of all of the Tanaitic teaching into the Mishnah. However, there were, of course, many things that were left out. He couldn't put every single thing that Tanaim said into the Mishnah, and later Later, a collection, an appendix to the Mishnah was organized as the Tosefta. Do not get confused between Tosfot or Tosfos and the Tosefta. They're two completely different things, although the etymology of the terms comes from the same root. The Tosfot is a medieval commentary, a collection of commentaries on the Gemara. The Tosefta is an appendix to the Mishnah, as it were. In the traditional set of Talmud, in the traditional set of the Gemaras, it's usually printed as the very, very last thing. But of course, you can also buy a set just of the Tosefta itself. It reads like the Mishnah, it smells like the Mishnah, it looks like the Mishnah, but it is of secondary authority to the Mishnah. That's the Tosefta. Very often the Gemara will quote something from the Tosefta by way of comparing it to a Mishnah, or by way of contrasting it, or raising a possible contradiction. That's the Tosefta. In the game of, pardon the crudeness of the expression, in the game of Talmudic poker, if you've spent any time learning Gemara, you know that much of what the Gemara is trying to do is trying to make sense. What the Amoraim, the sages, the Chachamim that came after the period of the Mishnah for about 300 years were doing, from about the year 200 to about the year 500, what they were doing is they were trying to make order out of the Mishnah, saying, well, the Mishnah here says one thing and there it says another thing. Is there a contradiction here? And if there isn't a contradiction, how do we resolve what seems to be a contradiction? Or why was the Mishnah codified this way, and why wasn't this topic addressed the following way? Or the Mishnah says one thing, the Tosefta says another, etc., etc., etc. Howard now asks another question. The Breita, or the Brisa, literally means outside. Anything which was not any teaching of the Tanoim which was not codified in the Mishnah, and then not subsequently codified in the Tosefta, is called a breita, meaning it's left out. It was left out of the Mishnah and left out of the Tosefta. Now, technically speaking, I'm not being precise. Technically speaking, anything which is not a Mishnah is a breita. Technically speaking, a Tosefta is also a breita because it's not in the Mishnah. But colloquially, we use these terms. To mean a breita means something which was out of the Tosefta and out of the Mishnah. If it wasn't written down in the Mishnah and it wasn't written down in Tosefta and it was left as part of the ether of oral law, so how do we know it? How do we know it? The Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara period, still preserved these oral traditions. And much of what the Gemara is also doing is analyzing these breitiot, or these breisios. And when the Gemara says Tanu Rabbanan, right? If you've ever spent 5 minutes learning Gemara, you've encountered this term, Tanu Rabbanan, or sometimes just Taf Resh. Tanu Rabbanan literally means the rabbis taught, but it means the Gemara is now quoting a brisa. It's quoting a Tanaitic source that was not from the Mishnah and was not from the Tosefta. And if it weren't for the fact that it's quoted in our Mishnah, if it weren't for the fact that it was quoted in the Gemara, preserved by the Amoraim as part of the ongoing oral tradition, no doubt it would be lost to us. No doubt there were teachings of the Tanoim that didn't get into the Mishnah, didn't get into the Tosefta, didn't happen to be quoted by an Amora in the Gemara, and they're lost to us. This is the corpus of the teaching of the Tanoim. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, his accomplishment was to codify and organize all of the oral law into the great work called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is no doubt one of the greatest cultural achievements of the Jewish people throughout its history. In some ways, even more so than the Gemara. Although this is, of course, debatable. It's like even though it's like the old, if there's a fight between Superman and Mighty Mouse, who's going to win? This is a debatable proposition. But in some ways, because of its originality of organization, the organization on which all subsequent Torah teaching has to, organize itself, the Mishnah itself is among the greatest cultural achievements. Sherry asks, was it controversial project at the time? It was. We don't know so much if it was controversial. When the Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah, that was controversial, and we'll get to that in subsequent discussions. No doubt there were people that objected to the codification of the Mishnah, to the abrogation of the time immemorial tradition of an oral law, to writing it down. Howard asks a question. Howard, do you have a way to focus your camera? We can hardly see you. No, that's the best it is. I trust that's not how you really look. Where are you, Howard? Let me pass you a microphone. Howard, are you there? You have a microphone now.
Yeah, I do, but the cam is really bad.
Where are you, Howard?
Right now, I'm in San Francisco, California, and I am in Sinai Memorial Chapel. I'm a Chomer, and I'm learning as the Mishnah is upstairs, and I'm in the lighting is poor here.
I see. Well, that's a fantastic mitzvah that you're doing. I don't know if everybody heard that. Howard is a shomer at a funeral home. According to our tradition, people that have passed away before their burial aren't left unattended. So he's doing that mitzvah and he's learning Torah at the same time. So you had asked halakhah and agadah in Mishnah and Gemara. What did you mean by that?
I guess my question is, if you look at the Gemara, there's you're learning laws, and then they refer back to little stories about Agadah, the kind of fill-ins, or they'll go back to quotes of Tanakh, maybe Tehillim or actual scriptures, and then they'll also give you laws. But I'm wondering if that's also in the Mishnah.
Right, so that's a good question. Now, is there Agadah in the Mishnah as well?
Yeah, that's the question.
Right. So that's a very good question. It happens that last semester in our study of the Rambam, when we studied the Rambam's introduction to Perek Chelek, which you can access through the archives, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the difference between halakhah and agadah. But in answer to your question, the short answer is that essentially the Mishnah does not contain a whole lot of agadah, of the kind of non-halachic, moralistic, historical, midrashic, homiletic, all of those descriptors of what agadah is. The Mishnah doesn't really. It's really much more apodictic is the term, meaning it's trying to give you the bottom line halakhah, normative halakhah on halachic matters. That being said, there are certain passages here and there that tend to be well known because they're the exceptions to the rule that do record agadic or agadic-like passages in the Mishnah, but it's really much more the exception than the rule. Some famous examples would be in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. The story about Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua and making him come on the Yom Kippur that falls out according to his calculation. There's a difference of opinion about how to calculate the calendar and what day Yom Kippur would come out, and that story is a well-known exception in Masechet Brachot, in the context of Kavanah B'Tfilah. There's a discussion about Moshe Rabbeinu and Milchemet Amalek, and when he raises his hands and lowers his hands. There are a number of exceptions, and there are a number of people that have written specifically on this topic, on Agadah in the Mishnah. But again, it's much more the exception than the rule. Let's go back to the Rambam.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. The Rambam goes on. V'haya b'tachlit hachasidut. He's again describing Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. V'haya b'tachlit hachasidut v'anava b'archakat ha'tanugim. He was a person of high caliber. He was righteous and pious and modest, etc., etc., etc. Hayat tzach lashon u'muflag mikol adam b'lashon ha'ivrit. He was a master stylist. Now this is significant. He had complete mastery of the Hebrew language. He spoke in a refined, perfect tongue. He was a master writer and stylist. Now this is very significant. The Mishnah, of course, was written in Eretz Yisrael, in Hebrew. It was written in a Mishnaic Hebrew. I mean, that's anachronistic. In other words, we call it Mishnaic Hebrew because it's the Hebrew that the Mishnah is written in. But it could have been written in Aramaic, which was the kind of the lingua franca of Eretz Yisrael at the time. But Rebbe writes the Mishnah in Hebrew. It's not biblical Hebrew. It's a subsequent strata of the Hebrew language, and it, in many ways, is recognized as the, recognized as a very, very rich level and form of Hebrew that the Mishnah is codified in. No doubt, Rebbe chose to write in Hebrew because that is the language of the Jewish people, and he's writing at a time when the Jewish people are going out into have gone out and continue to be in the exile, even though he and the Chachamim that he was in contact with, they were all in Eretz Yisrael. But subsequently to the codifying of the Mishnah, the center of Jewish learning shifts away from Eretz Yisrael, away from Israel, to Bavel, to Babylonia, to what today is Iraq. The great academies of the Chachamim, the Yeshivot, are in what today is Iraq. There's a little pamphlet that very often students in Yeshivot have called Aiding Talmud Studies, which has this little map in the back with an overlay where you can see the map of the ancient world of the Tanoim and the Amoraim overlaid on like a clear overlay over the map of the modern map, and you can see where all of the yeshivot of the times of the Amoraim were, and the centers of Torah study in Eretz Yisrael, etc., etc., etc. And he writes it in Hebrew, and the Rambam makes a point to praise the style, the language of the Mishnah. Now, significantly, almost 1,000 years after Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi completes the Mishnah, the Rambam will complete his Mishnah Torah. We're going to talk about that a little more as we move along. But the Mishnah Torah, when the Rambam writes it, his great encyclopedia of halakhah, his restatement of the bottom line halakhah, which is very, very, very much influenced in style by the Mishnah, not so much in organization, but even there he's also influenced and inspired by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He looks at Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who takes the entire corpus of rabbinic knowledge, and even if Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi had done nothing but organize it into categories, it's the achievement of, the Dewey Decimal System. How do you organize a library? And go into, or the Library of Congress system, which seems to be the more popular cataloging system now. Go into the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., or go into any great library. Go into, if you have a university near you, go into a university library. And it's too bad because I was recently, last week, I visited Yeshiva University, where I had been a student in college and afterwards. And I happened to go into the library, which was a place, very dear to my heart when I was a student, and I spent many hours in the library. And I was both heartened but a little bit sad, a little bit nostalgic for the old card catalog, which they still have. I don't know why they still have it, but there's still the card catalog, but it's been moved. It's like off on the side. I assume that new books do not get cataloged in the card catalog, and it's all just on computer, and nobody would actually look anything up in the card catalog. But it's there. But the idea of how do you organize in the Library of Congress, which purports to hold essentially every book ever published. Well, how do you organize it? So you need to have some kind of sense of the hierarchy of knowledge. You need to have a theory of how, it's an epistemological theory. how do you organize knowledge? What disciplines are related to which disciplines, and how do they all fit together? And it's not just a question of what book belongs to the next book on the shelf, but how do we make a map of the entire known world? I don't mean the known physical world, I mean the world of ideas. So lahavdil, the organization of the Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was no less, and perhaps even more so, an accomplishment than the epistemological feat of the Library of Congress or the Dewey Decimal System. It's a statement about the organization and the map of knowledge. And when the Rambam organized his Mishnah Torah, his encyclopedia of the halakhah, he also, probably inspired by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, said, I'm going to make a hierarchical organization. He chooses a different way. Instead of organizing it into 6 major categories, he organizes it into 14 categories. The 14 Yud Dalid Gematria, right, is why the book, the Mishnah Torah, is also called the Yad HaChazakah. Yad, the hand, in Gematria is 14. So he calls it the Yad HaChazakah. The Mishnah Torah has 14 books, each subdivided into different sections, each section subdivided into chapters, each chapter subdivided into halakhot. But the inspiration for such organization comes from Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, even though he chooses to organize it in a different way. And similarly, the Rambam's choice of language is inspired by the master stylist, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Everything the Rambam wrote was written not in Hebrew, but in Judeo-Arabic. The text that we're studying now by the Rambam is a modern translation into Hebrew of a text originally written in Judeo-Arabic. The commentary on the Mishnah. The Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, is not written in Hebrew, but the Mishnah Torah, which he understands is his magnum opus. He understands it's his codification of the halakhah for all generations and for Jews of all locations, has to be written in Hebrew, because Hebrew is the common language of the Jewish people. And when he writes it in Hebrew, he writes in a Hebrew that echoes the Mishnaic Hebrew of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So when he writes the Mishnah Torah, he's very much looking to the Mishnah itself as a model. And here, in praising Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, we see that. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, for the Rambam, is of course number 2 only to Moshe Rabbeinu, himself. Let's skip ahead. What did he do? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi rebates Torah b'Yisrael. He disseminated Torah throughout the Jewish world. Kibeitz hashmuot v'amamarim v'machlokot hamorim me'az Moshe Rabbeinu v'ad yamav. And he gathered up the definitive interpretation, the statements of the Chachamim, the differences of opinion from Moshe Rabbeinu up until his day. Now this is significant. The Rambam points out that in the Mishnah, as opposed to the Mishnah Torah, and this is one very significant difference between the two works, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi included machloket. He doesn't just tell you the bottom line, although often he does that. But he will often tell you there's a machloket. Beit Hillel said this and Beit Shammai said that. That one Chacham, that all of the Chachamim said this and Rabbi Akiva said that. He tells you that there's machloket about things, although he also indicates through different rules of composition what is the normative halakhah. But the Mishnah also records the minority opinion. V'haya hu atzmo mim'atike hashmuah ho'il v'hu kibel mishimon aviv שקיבל מגמליאל אביו, שקיבל משמעון אביו, שקיבל מגמליאל אביו, שקיבל משמעון אביו, שקיבל מהלל אביו, etc., etc., etc. And the Rambam here inserts this characteristic we've seen again and again and again, the shalshelet hadorot, the chain of the generations that hooks Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu himself. And he tells you the names, he tells you the pedigree of the teaching, again, to testify to the integrity of the rabbinic teaching, of the oral law put into writing in the Mishnah. And again, as I've mentioned, there probably is a part of the Rambam's motivation is part of the polemic against the Karaites at this point. וכאשר קיבץ שיטות המאמרים החל בחיבור המשנה, הכולל פירוש כל המצוות הכתובות בתורה, ממנו שמועות מקובלות ממשה עליו השלום. Right? He collects together in the entirety of the Mishnah. So what's there? Dinim. Hold on a second. Go back 1 second. Right? Shmuot mekubalot mimoshe alav hashalom. The teachings, the shmuot, literally the things you hear, but the shmuot mean the received halakhot from Moshe. And then what else? Dinim shehutzu behekesh ve'ein behem machloket. Laws that are not written out, that are not part of the received tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu on how to interpret a pasuk, but which are learned out through hekesh. We pointed out last time that hekesh is specifically speaking, hekesh is one of those tools that we use to learn things out by the juxtaposition of words in the Torah. But hekesh is sometimes also colloquially used to mean the laws, the hermeneutical principles. I suggested to you, looking in the Art Scroll Siddur, I think I even sent it to you, I put it up onto the website, the Shlosh Esrei Midot HaTorah Nidreshet Bahem, the 13 hermeneutical principles by which the Torah is elucidated. These are secondarily, these are the halakhot that are learned out. And then finally, dinim hutzu v'nafla behem machloket bein shnei hekeshim v'kavam b'machlokotam ploni al markach u'ploni al markach. Things that were matters of dispute. V'hafilu haya cholek yachid cholek al rabim. Even in cases where all of the chachamim said one thing, and one lonely sage, one lonely rabbi was in the minority and was in the dissenting opinion, kavad divrei hayachid v'divrei harabim. And this is one of the innovations of Mishnah, that the minority opinion is preserved and recorded in the Mishnah. V'asa ze le'inyanim mo'ilim ma'od, shezcharam b'mishnah be'edyot v'ani azkarem, aval acharei ikar gadol ra'iti l'zachrohena. והוא שיש לומר לומר אם פירוש התורה כמו שיסדנו מקובלים ממשה, כמו שאמרנו מאמרם, כל התורה נאמרה, כל תהו פרטיה ודקדוקיה מיSinai. So the Rambam asks an important question. Look here. We mentioned last time. Parshat Bahar. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe Bahar Sinai lemor. God tells Moshe at Har Sinai the following thing. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem ki tavo el haaretz, etc. He teaches him the laws of Shemitah. This is in Sefer in Parshat Bahar. He teaches him the laws of Shemitah. So Rashi asks, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. Why does the Torah need to emphasize that these laws were given at Har Sinai? Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai, which is today a colloquialism that means, what's that got to do with the price of tea in China? What's one thing got to do with the next? Why does the Torah specify Har Sinai? V'halo kol ha-mitzvot ne'emru b'Sinai. All of the mitzvot were stated at Sinai. Ella, rather, ma shmita ne'emra klaloteha ufrateha v'diktukeha miSinai. Just like Shemitah was specified, all of the laws, all of the details, all of the pratim, all of the minutiae of Shemitah were taught to Moshe at Har Sinai. Af kulan nemru klalotev ditukeyan miSinai. So all of the mitzvot were taught to Moshe in detail at Har Sinai. So the Rambam asks a question: if all of the Torah was taught to Moshe at Har Sinai, maybe Har Sinai means the 40 days and 40 nights, maybe it means, again, going back to our earlier machloket, maybe it means throughout the 40 years of the giving of the Torah. But if the Torah was given with all of its details to Moshe Rabbeinu, how do we have machloket? How do we have differences of opinion? If the Rambam has to be consistent. If the system has integrity, where does machloket come from? Mahen oto halakhot hayechidot asher yamru behem shehem halakhah le-Moshe miSinai. So we have this concept of a halakhah le-Moshe miSinai, a law that's stated to Moshe at Sinai. Now, this is a concept which I assume, or I trust you've heard of before, that the written Torah obviously can't contain everything and its explanation. And some things are telegraphed in the Chumash, in the written Torah, and it came with an instruction booklet. But the instruction booklet was not written down. That's the oral law. Now, we know this, by the way. We have oral law. We have oral traditions in all types of things. I mean, not just the Jewish culture. Many cultures have a rich oral tradition. The classics of ancient Greece, the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc., these were originally oral works. And there were people, scholars, sages in those communities that would commit the entirety of Homer to memory, and they would recite them. That may be the reason that it's set in a type of verse as a memory aid. And by the way, there are all types of indicators in the Mishnah, that the Mishnah, the teachings of the Mishnah, are preserved in such a way that to be memory aids, mnemonic devices, etc. Before it was written down, when it had to be preserved orally. The idea of an oral culture is not unique to the Jewish people. It's just possible that we made the most of it. But the idea that whole bodies of things would be preserved orally is one of the kitschier examples is, what is Humpty Dumpty? Can anybody tell me what Humpty Dumpty is?
To rhyme? To rhyme?
Yeah, he's an egg. He's an egg, right? And everybody knows that Humpty Dumpty is an egg. I mean, he's an anthropomorphized egg. But everybody knows he's an egg. I mean, Google right now Humpty Dumpty and look at the images, and you'll see that it's all, like these eggmen. But nowhere in the text is there an indicator that we're talking about an egg, right? The text, again, Lahavdil, pardon the expression, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. There's nothing in the Torah Shebichtav, that says he's an egg. The interpreted tradition is that this character is something of an egg. Now it's true, Esther points out, hello Esther, Esther points out that it's probably some type of allegory for something in English history, although I don't remember what. I'm sure Wikipedia can help you to figure this out. But Vahoraya, there are all types of traditions about how to interpret a text. This is just the kitschiest one that that comes to mind. And there you go. Alan Goldenberg helped us out. He will summarize the teachings of that Wikipedia article and disseminate them to us afterwards by email for extra credit. So the Rambam has a question. What's halakhah le-Moshe miSinai? What are these teachings to Moshe? The instruction manual, the oral instruction that came along with the Torah. And if it was all taught to Moshe, the klaloteha u'prateha, in minute detail, how is it possible that we have a machloket? How is it possible we have a difference of opinion about how to interpret things? This will be our topic when we meet next week. On the Shir homepage, I uploaded something called the Rambam's letter to Rav Pinchas Hadayan. I uploaded it in English. The Igeret of Pinchas Dayan. Pinchas Dayan was a critic of the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam wrote a lengthy letter, which is very, very significant. I uploaded it in English translation, or it's a part of the letter in English translation, and piggybacked to his defense of his work. He makes a statement about the Mishnah and about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. In many ways, it's an important parallel text to what we were talking about. So I recommend that you look on the Shir homepage and download this text. To supplement your knowledge of what we discussed tonight. In theory, I will address it next time, but it's the kind of thing you can all read on your own. Of course, if you have any questions, you are always free to contact me by email or by Google Chat or you can buzz me now, whatever that is. I really don't know. There's my email in the panel, and we'll continue with this question about what's machlokas and where does it come from next week. I'll stay on for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Shabbat shalom. H-U-M-P-T-Y, D-U-M-P-T-Y. H-U-M-P-T-Y. M. P-T-Y. There you go, Alan. I did make it to the Sperm sale. I did make it, but I was only there for a few minutes. Have you been to the new base medrash from YU? Alan?
No, it was under construction last year.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it looked like it was